Welcome back, my friends. Thanks again for joining us for another episode as we continue studying the book of Genesis together. If you're following along with us, we are in Genesis chapter number 26, and I would start this by saying a phrase that a lot of us, especially if you're a parent, has said before, and that phrase is, "Here we go again." You ever seen, maybe as a parent, a situation to where it seems like no matter how many times you instruct a child or instruct someone around you, that they are completely convinced that you have no understanding of what's really going on, and you find themselves going out to do the same thing, and in a lot of occasions going out hurting themselves or going out and finding themselves in a struggle where they run out to do the opposite of what you told them to later call you out to help them out of their scenario. I've known several like that, and several scenarios when I did that myself growing up. And it's easy to do. And in the passage we're looking at today, we find ourselves in the same spot. And you may wonder what it is. Younger kids, they say, well, I know better. I can figure this out. There's a million things. A lot of it, they just don't have life experience. Well, you see that in a scenario with somebody who honest, you'd almost think would have experience and would have heard enough from his father to know not to do this. And we're going to see a familiar story that we saw happen to Isaac's father twice in a decision he makes, and it just makes you wonder why they continue to make the same mistake. Let's look at this in chapter 26 of Genesis. There was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of Philistines in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt to live in the land which I will tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife. And here we go, and he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," because he thought lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Quite obviously she is your wife, so how could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I said, lest I die on account of her." And Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Again, you see a very similar scenario. The one I give credit to is Isaac doesn't go to Egypt. He follows instructions, and he goes to where God tells him to. And we'll see later how God blesses this. But when he gets to the place, he gets down, and immediately he gets asked a question, who are the people? And he immediately thinks about his wife Rebekah and says, she is my sister. Now, there are some, much like with Abraham, that want to argue the fact that there is a relative amount of truth to this. Now, if you remember, Abraham sent back his servant back to Laban's house, a cousin's house, basically, brought back a daughter of the family. So they were related, but they were not brother and sister. And so a lot of people say, well, it's kind of close. Well, it's either true or it's not true. He could have said, she's my cousin or whatever. And that honestly wasn't as abnormal in that day as it would be today. But in this scenario, what you see, which is still surprising to me when I read this, is the fact that maybe Abraham never told him. But I wonder, think about the first time when he goes to Egypt and the problems. Well, both times it brought grief. It brought grief and discomfort to his wife. It brought possible grief. He was kicked out. Other long-term issues, maybe, what his family saw, what his descendants saw, or at least his servants. At that point, he didn't have any, but at least his servants. And the example he showed as the one who's following God. And you go back to a scenario where he repeats this. And I don't know if maybe he never told Isaac, but he repeats the same mistake in fear. Now, that's the thing I want to look at just for a moment. Isaac repeats this in fear. What does he say? He's afraid that if he admits that this is his wife, that he will end up being killed because she's beautiful. Now, the foreigner going into a land, was there a possibility that could happen to Isaac? Well, unfortunately, yeah, there was a possibility of that. I think one thing you've got to catch on to is we read at the end of this how God reminds Isaac about how he will take care of us. Later on, he does it. He reminds Isaac about the fact that he is part of the promise that God gave to Abraham that ultimately is now known to us as Israel. We know that Isaac's son, Jacob, becomes the father of the 12 brothers, 12 tribes of Israel, now today known to us as Israel or the Jewish people. So we know he's part of the process, and by faith alone he could have trusted in that. But for some reason he did. And it's amazing for me how sometimes our circumstances do that. We can have all the truth. We can have all the knowledge. We can know what God has done. We can see what God has done in our lives and the lives of people around us. And yet how easy it is, if we're not careful, to repeat the same mistake for no necessary reason. We have enough biblical truth to know how to act, and yet somehow we continue in certain circumstances to make wrong decisions. My challenge to you today is it's easy. Maybe we've seen it. There's a natural tendency, whatever it is. Take a moment and don't just react irrationally. That's really what's happening here. You got an irrational statement. The fear of what might have happened. Maybe they knew what happened. Obviously, there was a legitimate fear. This could have happened. The Philistine people were not God-fearing people. As you will learn much more, they become the enemy of Israel, but they're not God-fearing people. They were very pagan, which means the practices they would do were very sinful, which it makes him believe he has a valid reason for it. But here we go again. We go back to a king or to a ruler of a pagan world telling a believer of God how wrong he was. And again, God using the least likely of people to teach Isaac truth. And I hope that still doesn't have to be the case, but sometimes it does. So my challenge to us is to stop for a second and just take a moment and consider what's happening. Think, again, we talked about this last episode, think a little bit long term. And here's what I would just say in this situation. Think about your wife and what situation you might have put Rebecca in for your own protection. And there's a lot you could dig into this. I mean, this is just, what we look at in Old Testament a lot of times. This is just a history. It's a history of what happened. We know later that God protected him. It's another proof of God's blessing and promise to the covenant that God will always take care of him. But again, this is, Old Testament, a lot of it is just history. It's not that God said this is what you should have done. God's not bragging on Isaac for doing it. I mean, honestly, you can look through the story of David and how many things David did wrong. And yet what made him, he was called a man after God's own heart. What was the difference? The difference was someone like Saul did wrong, but refused to ever admit it, refused to ever take responsibility and get right with God. David acknowledged that and had, in his wrong, would take responsibility. And there was a lot of consequences to his wrong. Please don't think that he got away with all, but there was a lifelong list of consequences. But at the end of his life, he was reminded that he was blameless. He wasn't blameless because he did not sin. He was blameless because he was willing to get right with God. And that's the advice. When you look at the Old Testament, don't look at it as God said this is okay. You look at it as what we learned. They made a mistake and there are consequences from that. So take that from this. And even though we've learned it's 2 other times where there were negative consequences, sometimes we can make the same mistake. Learn from that. Learn that we have to make a choice not to repeat what we know or what we've seen. We make a choice to make wise decisions in our own lives. Again, thanks for joining us today as we just look in a little bit into chapter 26. Stick with us as we'll continue in chapter 26 next time, continue to work our way through the book of Genesis. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.